Chapter 4. Problems for the Desire Theory. The previous chapter offers a very nice laundry list of attractions of the desire satisfaction theory. These attractions help to explain why it is so popular, but, you guessed it, there are also a number of difficulties that this theory faces, and some of them are serious enough to force us to revise the view, and possibly even to reject it. To appreciate these worries, let's remind ourselves of the two central claims of the desire theory. A. If something is good for us, then it fulfills our desires. B. If something fulfills our desires, then it is good for us. A tells us that something must satisfy our desires in order to be good for us. Desire satisfaction is necessary for becoming better off. B tells us that satisfying our desires is enough to make us better off. Desire satisfaction is sufficient for becoming better off. Let's begin by considering A, and then move to a discussion of B. Getting what you want may not be necessary for promoting your good. We can test A by seeing whether we can come up with an example in which something benefits us even though it doesn't satisfy any of our desires. If there are any such examples, then A is false. There do seem to be such examples. 3 spring to mind. The first is that of pleasant surprises. These are cases in which you are getting a benefit that you didn't want or hope for. Imagine something that never appeared on your radar screen, say a windfall tax rebate, an unexpectedly kind remark, or the flattering interest of a charming stranger. It makes sense to say that you're a bit better off as a result of such things, even though they didn't satisfy any of your desires. Of course, now that you've experienced such things, you may well want more of them, but that's because they have made your life better already. And they did that without answering any of your pre-existing desires. The second case is that of small children and the severely mentally handicapped. We can benefit such people in a number of ways, even though we don't give them what they want. A parent benefits her 3-year-old by getting him vaccinated against various diseases, even though the child doesn't want the shots, and doesn't know enough to want to be free of the diseases that he is being immunized for. A psychologist can benefit a mentally unstable person with a treatment that may be the last thing she wants. We are sometimes able to improve the well-being of such people, even though we don't give them what they want. The third case is suicide prevention. Those who are deeply sad or depressed may decide that they would be better off dead. They are often wrong about that. Suppose we prevent them from doing away with themselves. This may only frustrate their deepest wishes, and yet they may be better off as a result. We will return to this example later. In each of these cases, we can improve the lives of people without getting them what they want. They may, later on, approve of our actions and be pleased that we acted as we did. But this after-the-fact approval is something very different from desire satisfaction. Indeed, it seems that the later approval is evidence that we benefited them, even though we did not do anything that served their desires at the time. And that is evidence that A is mistaken. Getting what you want may not be sufficient for promoting your good. If B is true, then we are better off whenever our desires are satisfied. There are many reasons to doubt this. Desires based on false beliefs. Sometimes we want something for its own sake, but our desire is based on a false belief. When we make mistakes like this, it is hard to see that getting what we really want improves our lives. Suppose you want to hurt someone for having insulted you when he did no such thing. You aren't any better off if you mistreat the poor guy, or perhaps you desperately want to be popular with a certain group of people, but only because you think that they are glamorous and happy. Once you get to know them better, you come to realize how shallow and miserable they are. As the old saying goes, beware of what you wish for, it may come true. From now on, then, we should understand the desire theory to insist that it is only informed desires whose satisfaction will improve our lives. Fulfilling desires based on false beliefs may not improve our welfare. So the real thesis under consideration will be C. If something fulfills our informed desires, i.e. those not based on false beliefs, then that thing is good for us. Disinterested and other regarding desires. All of us want some things that seem entirely unrelated to us. Our desires are directed, say, at the interests of strangers, or at no interests at all. Perhaps I want there to be an even number of planets, and now that Pluto has been banned from the club, I've finally gotten my wish. In such cases, we can get what we want, even though it is hard to see how our lives are improved as a result. A few years ago, I read about a whale that had beached itself on a New England coast. I remember wanting that whale to survive, to be eased back into the ocean without being harmed. And it was. It's easy to see that the whale was better off as a result of the rescue operation, but it's not easy to see that my life got any better. There is a natural reply to such examples. My life was indeed mildly improved because I was pleased to get what I wanted. And that may be true. The problem with this reply, however, is that it is not available to desire theorists. That's because the desire theory does not assign any intrinsic value to pleasure. If desire theorists are correct, then your life goes better just so long as more of your desires are satisfied, regardless of how much pleasure this yields. A more pleasant life is not necessarily better for those who live it. There is a quite different reply we might make on behalf of the theory. We might amend C to read D. If something has fulfilled our informed, self-regarding desires, then that thing is good for us. Self-regarding desires are those that concern only yourself. Since my desire for an even number of planets, or for the whale's rescue, were not self-regarding, then they cannot serve as counterexamples to D. Disappointment. Suppose that you form a self-regarding desire that isn't based on any false beliefs, and you get what you want. If D is true, this guarantees some improvement in your life. But consider a young musician who has staked his hopes on becoming famous one day, and that day comes, but all he feels is disappointment. He got what he wanted, he knows it, and he hates how it feels. Getting what you really want can sometimes be a huge letdown. All that buildup, and then, rather than any feeling of joy, just a blank sort of sadness, or worse. You've invested yourself in some project, have brought it to a successful end, and then find yourself filled with emptiness, boredom, or depression. I was recently reminded of these points when reading the following passage in John McEnroe's autobiography. I was playing great tennis, and I destroyed Ivan Lendl to win the '84 Masters. I'd finally taken my game to what felt like a notch above all my opponents. It should have been great. I wish it had been, but it wasn't. It still felt hollow. I'd thought it would help straighten me out, but it wasn't doing a thing for me inside. It reminded me of the story of King Midas. My success wasn't translating into happiness. If seeing your desires come true only makes you miserable, then how could this mark an improvement in your life? D commits us to saying that you are better off in such a case. This is very difficult to accept. We could, of course, modify the desire theory once again. E. If something has fulfilled our informed, self-regarding desires and we are pleased as a result of this, then that thing is good for us. E might be true, but that should be small comfort to the desire theorist, for it now seems that pleasure is what is making our lives better off rather than desire satisfaction per se. That, of course, is something that hedonists will defend, but it's bad news for desire satisfaction theorists. After all, if getting what you want only makes you miserable, it is hard to see how you are any better off as a result. Ignorance of desire satisfaction. Consider a case in which my informed, self-regarding desires are satisfied. I get what I'd hoped for. But I don't realize this. I never know that my goal has been met. It doesn't seem that I am any better off in such a situation. Imagine a person deeply committed to finding a cure for a terrible disease. After years of hard work, she succeeds, but she goes to her grave never realizing this. She thinks her efforts have been wasted. Her success does not, by itself, mark any improvement in her life. Or think of a man who very much wants to be a father. He has a series of relationships, one of which leads to a pregnancy and then to a child. But the mother never informs him of this, and he never finds out through other channels. His desire is satisfied, but his quality of life has not improved. As in the cases of disappointment, what we have here are examples in which our informed, self-regarding desires are satisfied, but we don't seem to be any better off as a result. That spells trouble for the desire satisfaction theory. Impoverished desires. According to the desire theory, in any of its versions, having a good life is essentially a matter of fulfilling your desires. Our desires, however, are often shaped by the way we have been raised. The expectations that we have been taught to have are especially important influences, and this creates a problem. Some parents have raised their children to believe themselves unworthy of love or incapable of real accomplishment. Some societies continue to treat women among them as second-class citizens, if citizens at all. Women in such societies are told from the earliest age that any political or professional hopes are unnatural and beyond their reach. It's easy to take such messages to heart. If you are told from the cradle that your greatest ambition should be to serve your master, then you may well end up with no desire any stronger than that. If desire fulfillment is the measure of a good life, then such lives can be very good indeed. That doesn't seem right. For instance, it is tempting to think that a slave cannot live a very good life, regardless of whether her desires are fulfilled, and that is because she is unfree. But desire theorists reject the idea that there is anything intrinsically valuable about freedom. Nothing is important in its own right, not intellectual or artistic achievement, not freedom, not pleasure, unless one desires it. If it has been drilled into your head that it is foolish to seek freedom or that education is unnecessary for your kind, then a reasonable response may well be to abandon hope for any such things. Better to have goals you can achieve than to set yourself up for constant disappointment. And yet, what kind of life is that? The desire theorist seems forced to say that it may be among the best. The lower your expectations, the easier they are to satisfy. As a result, those who set their sights very low may have a great number of satisfied desires than those with more challenging goals, but this hardly seems to make for a better life. The paradox of self-harm and self-sacrifice. If the desire theory is correct, then getting what you want makes you better off. But what if people want to harm themselves? This needn't be irrational. For instance, people may feel remorse for wrongs they have done and want to do penance. Others may despise themselves, full of self-loathing, convinced that they deserve only harm rather than good. No matter their ultimate motive, they deeply want to harm themselves. In other cases, people want to sacrifice their self-interest in order to promote the good of someone they care about, or some cause that is more important to them than their own welfare. It seems possible for such people to succeed. People can willingly harm themselves, and they can sacrifice their well-being to causes that matter to them, but the desire theory denies this. If such people satisfy their self-destructive or self-sacrificing desires, then the theory says that they are better off. So long as they get what they really want, then they must be benefited as a result. And yet their fondest wish is to harm or to sacrifice themselves. So the desire theory generates a paradox. Wanting to harm or sacrifice yourself makes it impossible to do so. Since it does seem possible both to want such things and to succeed, the desire theory is suspect. The fallibility of our deepest desires. Most of us don't intentionally set out to harm ourselves, but there are other cases in the neighborhood that pose problems for the desire theorist. I am thinking here of suicide, where the would-be suicide is regarding her death not as a harm, but rather as a benefit. She is not trying to make herself worse off. Rather, she is trying to improve her life by ending it. True, this also has an air of paradox about it. Let's see what a desire theorist can say about such cases. There are many different kinds of suicides. The one that poses the sharpest problem for the desire theory is that of a person whose life, by our lights, has terrific promise and is definitely worth living. Yet the suicidal person does not share our view. Suppose, in a common example, that a young man's lover has broken up with him and left, never to return. He is stricken with grief and decides to kill himself. This becomes his obsession. He most wants to die. If the desire theory is true, then the deeper the desire, the better off its fulfillment will make you. Thus, in his case, dying is his best option. Nothing else will make him as well off. It is hard to accept that. And desire theorists may have an out. After all, their best view is that the satisfaction of informed desires is what contributes to your well-being, and the suicide's desire to end his life might be based on a false belief. But which belief would this be? He may be well aware of all of the facts of his life and look at them with only pain and anxiety. In that case, it is tempting to think that his false belief is this: my life is going very badly and isn't likely to get any better. The problem is that desire theorists may have to regard this belief as true. On their view, your desires determine how well your life is going. If this person is clear-eyed and sees that he is getting very little of what he wants, then his life really is going poorly. Further, he may be quite self-aware about what he is likely to want in the future, a relationship with his former lover, and realize that this desire is bound to be frustrated. If so, then his life is not going to improve. What we want to tell such a person is this: change your desires. Stop wanting her so much. Not that this is easy, not that it can happen overnight, but suppose that he won't, and that he knows this. We tell him to change his desires because his current obsession is only causing him misery and preventing him from taking an interest in what really matters. Yet, from the desire theorist's perspective, such advice is fundamentally mistaken. Things matter only to the extent that you care about them, so happiness is important only so long as we want it. What really matters depends entirely on our desires. If, at bottom, you really want to die, then you are better off dead. This is one of many possible examples of basic desires that can appear to be fundamentally off base. Consider the following cases, offered by philosopher Joel Feinberg. The first is that of an exhibitionist who exposes himself in public not to solicit or threaten others, but just because he wants, as Feinberg puts it, exposure for exposure's sake. Or a kleptomaniac, in Feinberg's example, a high school student who is otherwise as normal as you or I, but who was caught in possession of 21 shirt buttons, 7 pairs of clippers, 9 bike wrenches, 5 pocket mirrors, and a variety of oil cans, violin strings, and combs. He didn't intend to use these things for any purpose at all. He just wanted them in their own right. Feinberg's last example invites us to consider a well-off man who shoplifts only one kind of item, women's brasiers. He could easily afford to pay for these items. He does not enjoy stealing them and suffers great anxiety in worrying about being found out. If you ask him for an explanation of his bizarre conduct, he will confess himself as puzzled by it as any observer. Such cases allow us to see how one of the main attractions of the desire theory, its reluctance to criticize our desires, to hold them up to any objective standard of value, is also a weakness. It isn't that hard to satisfy these unusual desires, so if the desire theory is correct, the good life is easily within the grasp of such people. But the thought that any of them is living a good life is very hard to accept. Conclusion. There are a number of reasons to think that the good life consists in our getting what we want, but there are some serious problems with this suggestion and with each of its variants. Most of the problems boil down to this. The desire theorist cannot recognize that any desires are intrinsically better than any others. If your heart is set on repeatedly counting to 9 or on saying the word putty until you die, then on this view, succeeding in such tasks yields a life as good as can be for you. But a promising youth may have a death wish. An oppressed slave may want only to serve her master. A decent but self-loathing man may most want to be publicly humiliated. We can imagine these desires fulfilled, and yet the resulting lives appear to be impoverished rather than enviable. Indeed, we regard such people as unfortunate precisely because of what they want. Their desires are not fit to be satisfied because they fail to aim for worthy ends. To say such a thing, however, is to side with the objectivist and to reject an essential element of the desire theory. For the desire theorist, nothing but satisfied desires makes us better off, and there are no objective standards that elevate some basic desires over others. On this view, value is in the eye of the beholder, and so those who prefer to publicly expose themselves or to steal worthless trinkets may really be living the best life a human being can live. Compare two lives. The first is that of a successful professional musician who takes great enjoyment in seeing new cities, cooking gourmet meals for a beloved family, taking fine nature photos, and running marathons. The second is that of a partially lobotomized adult who has enough cognitive powers to have informed desires, though not very many, and none of great complexity. If you were deciding between them solely on the basis of self-interest, wouldn't you choose to have the musician's life, even if you knew that it contained fewer satisfied desires? Some adults have the mental powers of an infant or a very small child. I'm not claiming that such people have nothing to live for or that their lives cannot be good ones. I'm assuming, however, that such lives are not the very best ones that human beings can lead, and yet they may contain the greatest number of satisfied desires, especially if the relevant desires are very easy to fulfill. If the desire theory is true, the quality of life in such a case is unsurpassed. That, too, is very difficult to accept. Further, suppose that all of your deepest desires have been satisfied, but that this leaves you only completely miserable. The desire theorist must regard this as the best sort of life, whereas most of us would think it horrible to be in such a situation. I think that the challenges recorded here are serious enough to cast doubt on the desire theory in any of its versions. Getting what we want is not, as it seems, an essential part of the good life. It is neither a guarantee of it nor a requirement. What, then, holds the key to the good life? Happiness is surely a part of it. It can't be good for a person to go through life without any enjoyment at all, but as earlier discussions have shown, there is more to the good life than happiness. The conclusion we are forced to is that the good life depends on objective values, things that are valuable even if we fail to value them. Happiness is one objective value, autonomy is another. There are doubtless others. These are things worth wanting, things that we ought to obtain or achieve if we seek the best life for ourselves. Want the complete list? The only way to get it is by doing a lot more philosophy.